Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Part 2. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The morning sun cast its golden rays through the tall windows of Dan and Precious's new home, a beautiful mansion tucked away in a serene part of the city. It was a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a bright future. Precious, now married to Dan, was adjusting to her new life with a mixture of excitement and gratitude. But true to her nature, she remained humble and grounded, a reflection of her upbringing. In one of the spacious guest rooms, Adanna was carefully unpacking her belongings. Precious had insisted that her mother move in with them, a decision that Dan wholeheartedly supported. For Precious, having Adanna close was non-negotiable. Her mother had been her rock through the toughest times, and now it was her turn to ensure Adanna lived comfortably. "Are you sure I won't be a burden here?" Adanna had asked hesitantly when Precious brought up the idea. "Mama, you could never be a burden," Precious replied, taking her mother's hand. "This house is as much yours as it is mine." Dan had echoed Precious's sentiments, saying, "Your family, Mama Adanna. We're happy to have you here." Life as a family. Adanna quickly became an integral part of the household. She took it upon herself to help with chores and often spent her mornings tending to the small garden she started in the backyard. She said it reminded her of the simpler days in the village, where she and Precious had grown vegetables to make ends meet. Meanwhile, Precious was settling into her role as a wife, learning to balance her job at Megamart and her responsibilities at home. Despite their wealth, she insisted on cooking meals for the family, a habit she had inherited from her mother. One evening, as they gathered around the dining table, Adanna observed the way Dan and Precious interacted. There was a mutual respect and affection between them that warmed her heart. She silently thanked God for blessing her daughter with a good man. A new chapter, pregnancy. A few months into their marriage, Precious began to feel different. She experienced waves of nausea in the mornings and an overwhelming fatigue that was unusual for her. After much urging from Adanna, she visited the doctor, who confirmed the news she had been secretly hoping for: she was pregnant. Precious returned home, her face glowing with excitement. She found Adanna in the kitchen, humming a hymn as she prepared a pot of egusi soup. "Mama," Precious began, her voice trembling. "You're going to be a grandmother." Adanna dropped the spoon she was holding, her eyes widening in disbelief. "My child, are you serious?" Precious nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Mama." The doctor confirmed it. Adanna pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, her own tears falling freely. "This is the Lord's doing." "Oh, Precious, this is the beginning of a new blessing." When Dan returned home that evening, Precious shared the news with him. His reaction was one of pure joy. He lifted her off the ground in a celebratory hug and declared, "We're going to be parents." The arrival of the twins. Precious's pregnancy was smooth, thanks in no small part to Adanna's care. She prepared nourishing meals, ensured Precious rested, and often spent hours praying over her daughter and the unborn babies. When the time came, Precious was rushed to the hospital, where she delivered twin boys, Richie and Wealth. Their arrival brought immense joy to the family. Dan was overwhelmed with emotion as he held his sons for the first time, while Adanna couldn't stop marveling at the little blessings. "These children will grow up to do great things," Adanna said, her voice filled with conviction. "I will make sure of it." Adanna's role as a grandmother. As the twins grew, Adanna took on the role of caregiver with unwavering dedication. She fed them, bathed them, and rocked them to sleep, often singing the same lullabies she had sung to Precious as a child. Her bond with the boys was evident, and her presence allowed Precious to focus on recovering from childbirth and managing the household. "Mama, you're doing too much," Precious would often say, watching her mother chase after the energetic twins. Adanna would wave her off with a smile. "It's my joy to care for them. Let me do this." Precious was grateful for her mother's help, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Adanna was overexerting herself. Still, Adanna seemed happy, and the household functioned like a well-oiled machine. The twins grow up. As Richie and Wealth grew older, their personalities began to emerge. Richie was bold and adventurous, always looking for the next thrill, while Wealth was quieter and more reserved but equally mischievous. The boys adored their grandmother, often running to her with their little problems and listening intently to her stories. But as they transitioned into adolescence, their behavior began to change. They became more rebellious, often ignoring Adanna's instructions or talking back to her. Precious and Dan, busy with work and other responsibilities, were unaware of the growing tension. One afternoon, Adanna confided in Precious. "The boys are changing," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "They don't listen to me the way they used to." Precious frowned. "Mama, they're just going through a phase. I'll talk to them." But despite her efforts, Richie and Wealth's disrespect toward their grandmother continued to escalate, setting the stage for a storm that would shake the family to its core. The looming storm. Adanna tried to maintain peace in the household, but the boys' behavior began to weigh heavily on her. She prayed constantly, asking for wisdom and strength. She didn't want to burden Precious with her concerns, but deep down, she knew that something needed to change. Meanwhile, Precious remained unaware of the full extent of the problem. She trusted that her mother would handle the boys, not realizing that their behavior was becoming increasingly cruel. Adanna's love for her family kept her going, but her heart ached as she watched the boys drift further away from the values she had tried so hard to instill in them. The peace and joy that had defined their home now hung by a thread. Adanna's unwavering strength and faith would soon be put to the ultimate test, as the actions of the twins would lead to an event that would forever change the family's trajectory. The once harmonious household of Dan, Precious, and Adanna was now filled with tension as Richie and Wealth, now teenagers, began to rebel against the values that had been instilled in them. What started as occasional backtalk had escalated into outright defiance. Adanna, who had been their caregiver and confidant, now found herself the target of their growing disrespect. Despite her best efforts to guide them, the twins seemed uninterested in her wisdom. They often ignored her instructions, mocked her age, and made her feel like a stranger in the home she had helped nurture. For Adanna, who had devoted her life to her family, this change was a painful blow. A shifting dynamic. Adanna's patience was legendary, but even she felt the strain as Richie and Wealth became more unruly. They would leave their schoolwork unfinished, spend hours glued to their phones, and show little interest in family activities. Worse still, they often excluded her from conversations, dismissing her as old-fashioned. One afternoon, Adanna caught Wealth sneaking snacks from the kitchen after she had asked him to wait for dinner. "Why can't you just listen, Wealth?" she said gently but firmly. "I told you we'd eat soon." Wealth rolled his eyes. "You're not my mom, Grandma. Why don't you let me live my life?" Adanna was stunned by his tone but chose not to argue. She turned away, her heart heavy. That night she confided in Precious. "The boys are losing their way," she said. "They've forgotten the values we've tried to teach them." Precious sighed. "Mama, they're just going through a phase. Teenagers are like that. I'll talk to them." But her words, though well-intentioned, did little to address the root of the problem. Dan's blind spot. Dan, too, was unaware of how bad things had become. His busy schedule at work meant he spent little time at home, leaving Precious and Adanna to manage the household. When Adanna tried to bring up the twins' behavior, Dan often brushed it off. "They're boys, Mama Adanna," he would say. "They'll grow out of it." Adanna was disappointed but not surprised. She knew that raising children required consistent attention, and she worried that the lack of discipline would lead to bigger issues down the line. The breaking point. One rainy afternoon, Richie and Wealth came home from school in foul moods. Their uniforms were soaked, and they were irritated by the weather. As they entered the living room, they found Adanna sweeping the floor, humming a hymn. "Can't you do that later?" Richie snapped. "You're always in the way." Adanna paused, startled by his rudeness. "I'm just trying to keep the house clean, Richie." "Whatever," Wealth muttered, throwing his bag onto the couch. "You act like this is your house." Adanna's eyes widened at the comment. "What did you just say?" Richie smirked. "He's right. You don't own this house." Stop acting like you're in charge. The words stung, but before Adanna could respond, the boys exchanged a look. Richie nodded toward the door. Come on, let's teach her a lesson, he whispered loudly enough for Adanna to hear. Before she could react, the boys grabbed her arms and pushed her out onto the veranda. The rain poured down in heavy sheets, drenching her instantly. Stay out there until you learn to mind your business, Richie said, slamming the door behind her. Adanna stood in shock, the rain soaking her to the bone. She called out to them, but the boys ignored her. Hours passed, and the storm raged on. Adanna, shivering and exhausted, eventually collapsed onto the cold, wet ground. Precious returns home. When Precious returned from work that evening, she was horrified to find her mother lying unconscious on the veranda. She rushed to her side, screaming for help. Dan arrived moments later, and together they carried Adanna inside. What happened? Precious cried, her voice breaking. How did this happen? Dan called for an ambulance while Precious tried to revive her mother. Tears streamed down her face as she prayed fervently. Please, God, don't take her from me. Not like this. The paramedics arrived and rushed Adanna to the hospital. As they drove off, Precious turned to the twins, who were watching from the staircase. What did you do to her? She demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Richie and Wealth looked at each other but said nothing. We don't know what happened, Richie mumbled. Precious glared at them, her disappointment evident. We'll talk about this when I get back. The truth revealed. At the hospital, Adanna was placed in intensive care. The doctors informed Precious and Dan that she was in a coma caused by hypothermia and stress. Back at home, Dan decided to review the CCTV footage to understand what had happened. What he saw left him speechless. The footage showed Richie and Wealth pushing Adanna outside and locking the door behind her. When Precious returned home from the hospital that night, Dan showed her the footage. Her heart broke as she watched her sons treat her mother with such cruelty. How could they do this? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mama loved them. She gave everything for them. Dan pulled her into his arms, trying to comfort her. We'll handle this together, he promised. As Precious and Dan were grappling with the gravity of the situation, Precious's phone rang. It was the hospital. The doctor's voice on the other end was solemn. I'm sorry, he said. Adanna didn't make it. The words hit Precious like a physical blow. She dropped the phone, her legs giving out beneath her. Dan caught her just in time, holding her as she fainted in his arms. The aftermath. When Precious regained consciousness 2 hours later, she was inconsolable. The grief of losing her mother was overwhelming, and she blamed herself for not acting sooner. Dan tried to comfort her, but he too was struggling with his emotions. The loss of Adanna was a blow to the entire family, and the circumstances surrounding her death made it even harder to bear. The twins, unaware of the severity of their actions, were summoned to the living room. When Precious confronted them, they continued to deny their involvement until Dan showed them the footage. Richie and Wealth stared at the screen in silence, their faces pale. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the enormity of what they had done. You killed her, Precious said, her voice trembling with anger and sorrow. Your grandmother is dead because of you. The boys fell to their knees, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, but Precious couldn't bear to look at them. Dan decided that they needed to face the consequences of their actions and arranged for them to be sent to a disciplinary home. The family was shattered, and the home that had once been filled with love and laughter was now consumed by grief. Precious, struggling to come to terms with her loss, turned to God for strength, knowing that the road ahead would be long and painful. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, as if the air itself mourned the loss of Adanna. Her absence left a void that was impossible to fill. Precious spent her days in a haze of grief, her mind replaying the events that led to her mother's death. The house that once radiated warmth and love now felt cold and uninviting. Adanna had been the glue that held the family together, her wisdom and kindness a source of stability for everyone. Without her, Precious felt like a ship lost at sea. The funeral arrangements. Preparations for Adanna's burial began almost immediately. In accordance with cultural traditions, the family decided to hold the ceremony in their hometown, where Adanna had been born and raised. Dan took charge of the logistics, arranging transportation and coordinating with extended family members. Precious, however, was a shell of herself. She barely spoke, her eyes perpetually red from crying. She spent hours in Adanna's room, clutching her mother's favorite scarf and whispering prayers through her tears. "Mama," she would say softly, "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you." Dan tried to support her as best as he could, but he too was struggling. The sight of his wife in such pain broke his heart, and he found himself questioning how their family had come to this point. Confronting the twins. Meanwhile, Richie and Wealth had been sent to a disciplinary home, a decision Dan made after reviewing the CCTV footage. The boys were devastated, their guilt eating away at them. They hadn't fully understood the consequences of their actions until it was too late. At the disciplinary home, they were exposed to the harsh realities of life. The staff enforced strict rules, and the boys were required to participate in counseling sessions where they confronted their behavior. Slowly, the gravity of their actions began to sink in. "We didn't mean for this to happen," Richie confessed during one session. "We were just angry. But now she's gone, and it's our fault." Wealth nodded, tears streaming down his face. "We didn't know how much she loved us until now." Their remorse was genuine, but they knew that no amount of regret could bring Adanna back. The burial. The day of the burial was somber. Relatives and friends gathered in the small village to pay their respects. The ceremony was a blend of traditional rites and Christian prayers, a fitting tribute to Adanna's life. Precious stood by the graveside, her hands trembling as she clutched Dan's arm for support. The pastor spoke about Adanna's unwavering faith and her dedication to her family. "She was a woman of strength and grace," he said. "Her legacy lives on in the lives of those she touched." As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Precious broke down, her sobs echoing through the crowd. "Goodbye, Mama," she whispered. "I'll never forget you." Dan held her tightly, his own tears falling silently. The pain was raw and unrelenting, but he knew they had to be strong for each other. A house in mourning. After the burial, the family returned home to face the reality of life without Adanna. The silence in the house was deafening, and every corner seemed to carry a memory of her. Precious struggled to find purpose in her days, often retreating into her room to grieve in solitude. Dan tried to keep the household running, but he felt the weight of the loss as well. He missed Adanna's wisdom and her calming presence, and he worried about how Precious would cope in the long term. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Dan took Precious's hand in his. "We'll get through this," he said softly. "Your mother wouldn't want us to fall apart." Precious nodded, though her heart felt far from healed. "I just wish she was still here," she whispered. The twins returned. A week after the burial, Dan and Precious visited the disciplinary home to see Richie and Wealth. The boys looked different, thinner, quieter, and more subdued. They approached their parents cautiously, their eyes filled with remorse. "We're sorry," Richie said, his voice trembling. "We didn't mean for any of this to happen." Wealth added, "We miss Grandma. We didn't appreciate her when she was here, but we do now. Please forgive us." Precious stared at her sons, her heart torn between anger and sorrow. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "She loved you. She gave everything for you, and you treated her like she was nothing." The boys nodded, tears streaming down their faces. "We know, Mama," Richie said. "We'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Precious turned away, unable to face them. Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're still our sons," he said gently. "They need to learn, but they also need our guidance." After a long silence, Precious agreed to let the boys return home, but under strict conditions. They would have to earn back the family's trust through their actions. The road to redemption. Back at home, Richie and Wealth worked hard to make amends. They followed the house rules without complaint, helped with chores, and showed respect to their parents. They also began attending counseling sessions to address the underlying issues that had contributed to their behavior. Precious watched their efforts with cautious hope. She wanted to forgive them, but the pain of losing her mother was still fresh. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Richie spoke up. "Mama, can we say a prayer for Grandma?" Precious was taken aback but nodded. As Richie led the prayer, asking for forgiveness and guidance, she felt a glimmer of healing in her heart. Precious finds strength. Despite her grief, Precious began to draw strength from her faith and the memories of her mother. She returned to work, finding solace in the routine, and started to focus on rebuilding her family. Dan remained her rock, supporting her every step of the way. Together, they worked to honor Adanna's legacy by instilling the values she had taught them in their sons. The tragedy of Adanna's death had left deep scars, but it also served as a wake-up call for the entire family. They vowed to cherish one another and to ensure that her memory lived on in the way they loved and treated each other. The weeks following Adanna's burial were heavy with grief and reflection. Precious found herself navigating an unfamiliar void. The woman who had been her rock, her guiding light, was gone. The pain of losing her mother was compounded by the knowledge that it could have been prevented. Yet, amidst the sorrow, Precious knew she had to find a way to move forward, for her family and for herself. Coping with loss. Every corner of the house reminded Precious of her mother. The smell of freshly baked bread brought back memories of Adanna humming in the kitchen, and the garden she had lovingly tended now seemed lifeless without her presence. Precious would often sit there, clutching her mother's scarf, tears streaming down her face. Dan noticed how withdrawn Precious had become. He tried to support her, offering to take time off work and encouraging her to talk about her feelings. One evening, he sat beside her in the garden, the moonlight casting a soft glow over them. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. "I'm here for you." Precious nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just so hard, Dan. I feel like I've failed her." "You didn't fail her," Dan reassured her. "She knew how much you loved her. And she would want you to keep going, to be strong for the boys." Precious wiped her tears and nodded. "You're right. Mama wouldn't want me to lose myself in grief." The twins' struggle. Richie and Wealth's return home was marked by an air of awkwardness and tension. The disciplinary home had left a profound impact on them, and they were eager to prove they had changed. However, they were also weighed down by guilt. The boys avoided unnecessary conflict and threw themselves into chores and schoolwork. They started helping Precious in the kitchen, something they had never done before. They also spent time in the garden, reviving the plants Adanna had cared for so diligently. One afternoon, Wealth approached Precious hesitantly. "Mama, can we talk?" Precious turned to him, her expression guarded. "What is it, Wealth?" "I just want to say I'm sorry again," he said, his voice trembling. "We didn't realize how much Grandma meant to us until it was too late. We'll never be able to make it up to her, but we want to try to make things right with you." Richie, who had been standing nearby, joined in. "We'll do whatever it takes, Mama. Please give us a chance to show you that we've changed." Precious looked at her sons, their remorse evident in their eyes. Though her heart was still heavy, she saw a glimmer of hope. "It will take time," she said softly, "but I'm willing to give you that chance." Call to forgive. Precious turned to her faith for guidance, praying for the strength to forgive her sons. One Sunday, during a church service, the pastor's sermon seemed tailored to her struggle. "Forgiveness is not just for the person who wronged you," the pastor said. "It's for you too. When you forgive, you release the burden of anger and pain. You allow yourself to heal." The words resonated deeply with Precious. She realized that holding on to her anger would only prolong her suffering. Adanna had always preached love and forgiveness, and Precious knew she needed to honor her mother's legacy by doing the same. That evening, after dinner, Precious gathered the boys in the living room. "Richie, Wealth," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "I've been praying for guidance, and I want you to know that I forgive you." The boys stared at her, their eyes wide with surprise and relief. Tears streamed down their faces as they rushed to embrace her. "Thank you, Mama," Richie said, his voice choked with emotion. "We promise we'll never let you down again." Healing as a family. The family began to rebuild their bond, one day at a time. Dan played a crucial role, organizing family activities to bring them closer. He encouraged open communication and ensured everyone felt heard. The boys took on more responsibilities at home, helping Precious in ways they never had before. They also began volunteering at a local community center, inspired by their grandmother's legacy of kindness and service. One day, Richie and Wealth approached Precious with an idea. "Mama," Wealth said, "we want to start a scholarship fund in Grandma's name. She always believed in education, and we think it's a good way to honor her." Precious was moved to tears. "That's a wonderful idea," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you." A tribute to Adanna. The family worked together to establish the Adanna Foundation, a scholarship program aimed at supporting underprivileged children. The initiative became a source of healing for Precious, giving her a way to channel her grief into something positive. During the foundation's launch event, Precious gave a heartfelt speech. "My mother was the embodiment of strength, love, and sacrifice," she said. "This foundation is our way of ensuring her legacy lives on. Through it, we hope to touch lives the way she touched ours." The event was a success, and Precious felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since her mother's passing, she felt a spark of hope. Moving forward, though the pain of losing Adanna would never fully fade, the family began to find joy again. Precious, Dan, Richie, and Wealth grew closer, their bonds strengthened by the challenges they had faced together. Precious often found herself reflecting on her mother's teachings. "Mama was right," she would think. "Love and forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds." As the family sat together one evening, laughing over a board game, Precious felt a sense of peace. Though their journey had been marked by pain and loss, it had also brought them closer together. Adanna's spirit remained a guiding presence in their lives, her love and wisdom continuing to shape their future. The weeks turned into months, and the wounds of the past began to heal. Precious and her family worked together to create a new normal, one rooted in love, forgiveness, and the lessons Adanna had taught them. Though her absence was deeply felt, her spirit remained alive in their hearts and actions. Family restored. The Adanna Foundation became a centerpiece of the family's healing journey. The scholarship program gained traction, with local schools and organizations supporting the initiative. Every time a child received assistance, Precious felt a sense of fulfillment that brought her closer to her mother's memory. Richie and Wealth were instrumental in the foundation's success. They helped organize events, raised funds, and often shared their personal story to inspire others. The boys had transformed. Their earlier rebelliousness had been replaced by a sense of responsibility and empathy. "Mama," Richie said one evening as the family prepared for a foundation event, "I think this is what Grandma would have wanted. She always believed in helping others." Precious smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "She would be so proud of you both." Seeking forgiveness. Though the twins had shown significant growth, they still struggled with guilt over their grandmother's death. One evening, Wealth approached Precious with a heavy heart. "Mama, do you think Grandma forgave us before she passed?" he asked, his voice trembling. Precious placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Your grandmother's heart was filled with love. She forgave you long before you even realized your mistake. That's the kind of person she was." Wealth nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I just wish I could tell her how sorry I am." "You can," Precious said gently. "Talk to her in your prayers. She's always with us." That night, Richie and Wealth knelt beside their beds and prayed, asking for their grandmother's forgiveness and guidance. It was a cathartic moment that brought them a sense of peace. Rebuilding bonds. Dan played a vital role in keeping the family united. He organized weekly family dinners, where they would share their thoughts and reflect on their progress. He also encouraged the boys to pursue their talents, enrolling Richie in a soccer academy and Wealth in art classes. The twins excelled in their pursuits, and their achievements brought joy to the family. Precious found herself smiling more often, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her sons mature into kind and respectful young men. One evening, after dinner, Richie surprised Precious with a painting Wealth had created. It depicted Adanna in her garden, her face radiant with joy. "We wanted to give you something to remind you of Grandma," Richie said. "This is how we remember her, happy and at peace." Precious stared at the painting, her hands trembling. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." A celebration of life. On the one-year anniversary of Adanna's passing, the family held a memorial service in her honor. Friends, neighbors, and beneficiaries of the Adanna Foundation gathered to celebrate her life and legacy. The event was a mix of cultural traditions and modern tributes. There were songs, prayers, and speeches, each one highlighting the impact Adanna had on the lives of those around her. Precious stood before the crowd, her voice steady but emotional. "My mother was more than a parent. She was a teacher, a friend, and a pillar of strength. Everything I am, I owe to her. Through this foundation, we hope to continue her work and keep her spirit alive." As the crowd applauded, Precious felt a sense of closure. Though the pain of losing her mother would never fully fade, she knew Adanna's legacy would live on through the family and the lives they touched. The boys' redemption. Richie and Wealth continued to honor their grandmother's memory in their own ways. Richie became a role model for younger boys at his soccer academy, often sharing his story to inspire them to make better choices. Wealth's art gained recognition, and he dedicated his first exhibition to Adanna. One day, Wealth presented Precious with a new piece he had been working on. It was a portrait of the entire family, including Adanna, seated in the garden she loved so much. "It's our family," Wealth explained. "Even though Grandma isn't with us physically, she's still part of everything we do." Precious hugged her son tightly, her heart filled with love and pride. She would have loved this. A legacy of love. The family's journey had been marked by loss, pain, and mistakes, but it was also a story of growth, redemption, and unbreakable bonds. Precious often reflected on her mother's teachings, finding strength in her words and actions. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Dan proposed a toast. "To Adanna," he said, raising his glass. "The woman who taught us the meaning of love, resilience, and forgiveness." To Adanna, the family echoed, their voices filled with gratitude. As they clinked their glasses, Precious looked around at her family. Despite the challenges they had faced, they were stronger, closer, and more united than ever. Moving forward, life gradually found its rhythm again. The Adanna Foundation continued to thrive, and the family embraced their roles as custodians of her legacy. Precious, though still mourning her mother, found solace in the love and unity that had emerged from their shared pain. One evening, as she stood in the garden, watching the sunset, Precious whispered a prayer. "Thank you, Mama, for everything. I promise to keep your spirit alive in all that we do." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Precious felt a warmth that reminded her of Adanna's embrace. She smiled, knowing her mother was at peace. And so, the family moved forward, carrying Adanna's memory in their hearts and honoring her legacy through their actions. It was a journey of healing and redemption, a testament to the enduring power of love. Hello, besties, what do you think about this whole story? Share your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.